For the first time in over 3 years, Russian and Ukrainian officials sat across from each other, face to face, in Istanbul. No ceasefire was agreed to, but a massive prisoner exchange was. And while peace wasn't found, something deeper was revealed. Both sides are desperate, just for very completely different reasons, though. Welcome, everybody. This is the Brief Take, where I'll be covering major events like this periodically or maybe even weekly, just to keep you all updated while I work on the long form content. So today, let's get into what actually happened last Friday during the Russia Ukraine ceasefire meeting in Turkey and why it actually matters more than how most people think it does. So, what are the key outcomes here? Well, the first would be the major prisoner exchange. Now, both sides agreed to exchange at least 1,000 prisoners of war each, the largest swap since the war began. On the Ukrainian side of things, they framed the exchange as a humanitarian win for themselves and for the narrative. They intended it as a goodwill gesture to show readiness for diplomacy. The Ukrainian media also highlighted returning Avastal defenders as a symbolic moral boost for their troops and for the media narrative for their own country. Now, to be honest here, this isn't a humanitarian win for Ukraine at all. Yeah, they might get some prisoners back, but most of them are just going to be sent right back to the front lines, which pretty much makes it meaningless if you really think about it. This meeting wasn't done out of goodwill either. It was pushed mainly by Ukraine's Western backers, and that's just the truth of it. Make no mistake about it. Now, on Russia's side of things, they claimed it was a show of control over the battlefield dynamics and control and flow of the front lines. Moscow emphasized that its prisoners were treated poorly, using it to fuel domestic support. Also, Russian state TV downplayed the humanitarian angle and focused on the reciprocity. So Russia's clearly the one in control when it comes to how these negotiations are set up. I think most people can see that, unless they're just denying reality, which a few people are, and that's sad, but what can you do? And honestly, their demands aren't that unreasonable compared to Ukraine's. Because if you've been paying attention and not just glued to pro NATO talking points, you'll know Russia's dominating the battlefield currently as I'm talking to you all. Ukraine knows it, and yes, the West knows it as well. So, Ukraine proposed a 30-day ceasefire, which Russia obviously rejected, citing demands for territorial withdrawals. Now, Ukraine, in terms of their view on that, pushed for a ceasefire to create breathing room on multiple front lines that they're currently struggling to hold. They also demanded no territorial concessions, insisted any freeze must include Russian withdrawal, and they see Russia's conditions as basically unrealistic and designed to stall. Now, here's what I have to say, and it's a lot. Okay, at this point, the Ukrainian government and its officials are just being straight up unrealistic with what they're pushing for here. I mean, just take a look at the battlefield. They're clearly not in control of the situation at all. And if you've seen my other videos, I've talked about this countless times. Ukraine's idea of what they consider a victory doesn't match reality. Let's also be honest. After their failure of the 2023 counteroffensive and the Kursk holdout, which, by the way, was meant to strengthen their position in talks like these, that all fell apart. No surprise there. So at this point, Ukraine really doesn't have any leverage to refuse Russia's terms, especially if they still think they're going to keep all of those oblasts, which realistically they're not, but don't tell them that. Anyways, onto Russia's side of things. They basically reiterated that no ceasefire is possible unless Ukraine withdraws from Russian territory. And that I mean by Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye. They basically presented this offer as a means to allow some diplomatic concessions on both sides, respectively. They also emphasized that any deal must reflect new territorial realities. So Russia here is not wrong for being seriously distrustful of Ukraine and its Western backers, especially with this sudden push for ceasefire, right when parts of the Ukrainian front lines are falling apart in the Donbass region. They're not about to fall for another Minsk-style agreement. I think that's pretty clear for everyone here. And honestly, why would they stop now? They're taking more ground than ever before. So from a strategic point of view, it just doesn't make any logical sense, unless the goal is simply to save lives on both sides. But if that's all the ceasefire really is about, then sure, maybe. Otherwise, it doesn't really add up, again, at all. So, moving on to future negotiations being planned. Both sides agreed to exchange written ceasefire proposals and left the door open to reconvene on them. Ukraine, in terms of their perspective, are frustrated by a lack of immediate progress but wants to maintain diplomatic channels. Hopes future talks will involve Western partners or more public pressure to be placed on Russia. They warned against letting Russia stall to buy time. Now, this right here is very interesting. Why would Russia stall to quote unquote buy time when they're the ones making the gains on the front lines? It makes zero sense. I mean, seriously. And as for any future talks where Ukraine tries to lean on its Western backers to ramp up public pressure on Russia, that's not going to work at all. Russia isn't fazed by media narratives coming out of the West. You would think Ukraine and its allies would have learned something from all of that failed tactics and strategies by now, but apparently not. That's why they're frustrated. Russia's not falling for the same tricks it did back in 2014 and in 2015. Moving on to Russia's perspective on this. They pitched follow ups as proofs that Ukraine came to the table. So, Russia's perspective here is that they want Ukraine to continuously come back for diplomatic talks. Yeah, I don't think Russia's interested in pausing anything on the front lines anytime soon. And they made that pretty clear multiple times now. But I will say this, at least they're probably glad the Ukrainian diplomats actually showed up this time. You could say that much. And I think that was the whole main point of this, to illustrate that Russia is not some war monster that does not care for diplomacy when they actually do. In fact, it's the opposite. The West, and of course, Ukraine, are the ones that don't care about peace nor diplomacy. So, Delegation Dynamics. No presidential attendance. Neither Putin or Zelensky were there at the meetings. The only people that were there were the official diplomats representing both the Ukrainian and Russian governments. Now, on Ukraine's delegation side of things, it was led by the defense minister Rustem Umurov. They sought a framework that could lead to Zelensky-Putin meeting. Ukraine pushed for a direct top-level involvement in the future rounds. I think they're still a long way from Putin and Zelensky actually sitting down to talk. Like I've said, about 10 times now? Zelensky literally wrote in the Ukraine's constitution that he would never agree to any of Russia's demands. So yeah, you see the problem? Now, to be fair, the only real arguments I've seen for why Putin didn't show up to Turkey is because Turkey's in NATO. And most NATO countries have put an arrest warrant for him. So yeah, that would technically be a fair point. But then you got Zelensky putting words in Putin's mouth, saying he should be there since it was his proposal to restart the talks in Turkey. Except Putin never actually said that to begin with. Take that however you want, but that's the actual truth. Now, on Russia's delegation side of things, on how they viewed it, it was led by presidential aide Vladimir Medensky. Same in the talks in 2022. They downplayed the urgency of high-level involvement in their discussions. They're the ones that also floated the idea of Putin meeting Trump instead of Zelensky, which they kind of did, but in a phone call kind of way, earlier this week on Monday. Again, the reasons why Russia's downplaying the urgencies of these negotiations is pretty simple. Like I said earlier, they're the ones making the gains on the front lines. This meeting feels more like giving Ukraine a chance to open some kind of dialogue and possibly a way out before they even lose more than what Russia's already demanding to be recognized. I'm talking about the four oblasts and Crimea. Oh, and just a side note, as of this recording, Trump and Putin had a call after their meeting on May 16th, 2025, about restarting negotiations after 3 years. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Moving on to the international reactions. Western response and criticism. NATO leaders and EU officials expressed massive frustrations over Russian demands. The Ukrainian allies, that being the United States, UK, Poland, and Germany, backed Ukraine's refusal to concede any territory at all. Ursula von der Leyen criticized Russia's rigidity, hinting at possibly enacting more new sanctions upon Russia. France and Italy also called for more aggressive diplomacy, not appeasement. So this right here is one of the biggest reasons why I think these negotiations aren't going to lead to anything at all. There are just too many outside investors in this conflict. You've got Britain, who, let's be honest, already made some kind of mineral deal with Ukraine before Trump even had a chance to pressure Zelensky into backing America's own push for control over those resources. And at this point, Ukraine really has no say in any of it. They've got no leverage, and they're definitely not coming to the table as equals when it comes to a ceasefire agreement or implementation at all. Now, for Russia's backers, or dare I say neutral actors, looking upon this negotiation meeting, China issued a neutral statement encouraging dialogue without preconditions. India emphasized the humanitarian value of the prisoner exchange. Iran praised Russia's restraint while condemning NATO's role in the prolonging of the conflict. Again, Russia's playing the long game here. Just look at who showed up on the May 9th Victory Day parade. A lot of world leaders from all over the world. What that tells you is that Russia's not just holding its ground on the battlefield, but also building influence on the diplomatic and trade front. This whole thing was Putin using optics to come across as one being realistic, maybe even more humane than the West, by offering Ukraine a gesture of goodwill. And then when you compare that to Ukraine and the West, like I mentioned earlier, their optics aren't looking that great. All of a sudden, hysteria and calls for a ceasefire now? A few years ago, they would have laughed at an idea like that. Funny how fast that has changed, right? Now, Turkey's role as the main mediator in this negotiating meeting. So, they hosted the talks to reinforce its own diplomatic weight in the world. That much is true. They avoided direct alignment, keeping trade and energy relations open with both sides, positioned itself as the only NATO country with enough trust from both Moscow and Kiev. Oh, Turkey, where do I even start? They're clearly playing both sides here, but let's be honest, they lean more toward Ukraine and NATO. Erdogan even came out and said Crimea still belongs to Ukraine, not Russia. That tells you everything you need to know where they stand. Still, I'll give them credit for at least hosting the peace talks again. That's something. Though, personally, I would have preferred a more neutral country than Turkey, but hey, that's just my opinion. So, the main outlook on all of this. Basically, the talks didn't yield a ceasefire at all. But both sides showed they're willing to test diplomatic waters, at least, though for very different reasons. Russia's main takeaways on the meeting itself are as followed. This wasn't about scoring PR points for them. Moscow sees this as a final diplomatic off-ramp before shifting into a more prolonged and costly phase of the war for Ukraine. The Kremlin is signaling it's willing to end the conflict through negotiation if Ukraine concedes on the territorial lines. Russian officials framed the meeting as a serious attempt to avoid further escalation, especially in light of Western rearmament of Ukraine. But there's also a clear effort to show that Russia is not the one rejecting the peace, which could resonate with neutral or even the global south countries. Ukraine's main takeaway from this are also as followed. Kiev itself didn't initiate these talks from a position of strength. Instead, it's under heavy pressure from the United States and the EU to re-engage diplomatically. After months on the battlefield attrition and the major territorial setbacks, especially around Avdiivka and in the Kharkov region, the West is concerned about long-term viability for Ukraine. This round of talks appears more like Washington and Brussels nudging Zelensky to at least appear open to talks, partially to manage domestic politics in NATO countries. Ukraine still insists on full sovereignty, but the tone is shifting and the leverage it once had is, unfortunately, diminishing. So to wrap this all up for you guys, this whole negotiation meeting from last week, nothing's really changed in terms of how this conflict will end. This is still Russia's Cuban Missile Crisis moment, and for the West, it's an economic investment and a way to weaken its old rival, that being Russia. Neither side is going to find common ground, unfortunately. Even Trump seems to be realizing that. And honestly, I don't think he can actually deliver on his promise to end the war, even if he wants to. That he said, at least, he's glad some kind of dialogue between Russia and Ukraine has happened and hopes that it continues to happen. And right after those talks wrapped up last Friday, this week you have NATO countries that are coming out saying that once a ceasefire is in place, they look at sending in peacekeeping troops into Ukraine, of course. That obviously crosses Russia's red lines. So, yeah, this conflict isn't ending at the negotiating table at all. In fact, it's going to end on the battlefield, sadly. Anyways, That's all I got for now. I'll be doing more of these shorter updates periodically, maybe even weekly, while I keep working on the longer form videos, which you guys know takes a lot of time to actually put together. Your support really does mean a lot to me. So if you liked the video, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and if you haven't already, please drop a comment with your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you guys actually think. Otherwise, have a great day, guys.